Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Fert and this is Fert Tech. This video is part 4 of the PHP Basics tutorial set on syntax and technique. You can find the code related to this demonstration as well as a live working demonstration for the code in the links below down in the description. Also, I'd like to say thanks for watching, always appreciated. So, on the schedule for today, we are going to talk about associative arrays and multi-dimensional arrays in PHP. So, let's get started. Alright, go ahead and click on part 4, more arrays here, and take a look at our code. Of course, remember, we're starting here with the associative array code in the little bracket that I've kind of created here with the comments. So, of course, as I stated in the first section, there are 3 general types of arrays in PHP. The standard numerical indexed array, if you will. Then, of course, the other 2 that we are going to touch on today, the associative array, basically giving you an index as a name. I'll explain that a little bit more here in a second. And finally, the multi-dimensional array, which is an array inside a parent array, and you can have arrays inside of arrays inside of an array. But don't get confused, don't worry. I'll show you a nice way to structure it so it all makes sense and it's easy to kind of handle. So, alright. First thing is, with an associative array, I want to kind of point out and make it really clear. A lot of people, including myself when I first saw this, struggle with exactly what an associative array is or what is meant by an associative array. And it's not something that's difficult at all to get when someone explains it a little bit further than just, okay, here's an associative array. So one thing I want to point out to you is notice the way that we've written this here. And if you remember, from part 3, when we talked about arrays in general, when we just assigned a normal array, we had our name, and as you can see here, we just had our name and we'd just assign it with an index. Well, just like that, here with an associative array, we're doing the same thing as we did before. Let me zoom that in there for you guys a little bit. We're doing the same thing we did before, assigning a value to an array at an index, but this time, instead of using a numerical value as the index, or allowing it to assign the array index automatically like we had done in the first object-oriented example there, this allows us to use a name. So what do I mean by that? Well, note here the type. Not type as in the type of variable it is, but just the name type. So think of it like this. So I have this snake array, and I want to store information about this snake array. So it kind of makes sense, right? You know, you'd have some situation where you're categorizing snakes maybe in a outputter of some sort. Okay, so we're keeping track of snake 1 in this case, or snake set 1 maybe, for example. But this snake set 1, maybe this is cage 1 or tank 1 that the snakes are in, there are different types that you're organizing here. Okay, well, but each type, you know, might have certain things, like maybe it's venomous, maybe you want to know how long it is possibly. Well, of course you could go in and you could just be like, well, I'm just going to store that data directly into an array, and I'll just remember that, okay, this information's at this index, this information's at this index, and so on and so forth. But there's an easier and a better way to do it. So now, remember I said we had a few different attributes that we wanted to keep track of in our snake array, like type. Is it venomous? Well, what's its length? We just add those right in as our index values now. So now we name our index type. for the type of snake it is. So I store cobra in this example. Well, is it venomous? Well, we need to definitely indicate that the cobra is dangerous. So, is their venom dangerous? Sure. Okay. Well, we just use venom for our index value now, and of course length, just like we've done the first 2 times there. So you should start to see now how this can kind of become handy. Let's take a look at this echo statement, for example. Now, of course, remember, you echo, opening and closing quotes. One thing to note here is you'll see that I can use double quotes and then I can use single quotes inside of a double quote and it doesn't affect the statement, whereas if I was to use a double quote here, it would cause the statement to end. You notice how that does that. So that's one quick little tip that I have not mentioned yet. So little helpful hint there. So notice here how we've gone ahead and, just like before, we echo and concatenate a value, but when we call this value, instead of having to remember, or keep track of somewhere else where or how these, this information is stored in this array, oh, you know what? We already know because we can just straight call from the index name. So we say, okay, well, our index name is type that we're interested in. So, sure enough, let's check out our live example over here. So, like I was saying before, we're storing the value, and of course, the accessing the array with type gives us cobra. Why is that? Of course, like I had mentioned and was explaining before, that is because associative arrays use pairs. There's a key value, which in this case is our type, and there is a value that we store for that key, which is cobra. So now you can kind of see how this works. We have a key or a name that we provide for our index, and that for everyone that wants to use this array from now on knows, oh, okay, well, the type is automatically. So you can kind of see how this organization use of associative arrays in this type of environment can be helpful. And there is actually a step further to this, whereas when you do this type of associative indexing, it also allows you to easily convert to something called a JSON file, which I'll add another separate video set on later, that is very, very handy for passing data between different portions or different entities in a web server or web environment. Of course, that's a different topic. I don't want to go into that right now, but we can definitely see some benefit from using this associative idea. So, again, like we did before, we have a couple of ways we can do this. So I always like to start with this one first because it's a little easier to see how this fits together. And now once you kind of understand, then you can kind of move on to a little bit. And some people like this better because, as you can see, I can just create, I simply have my parameter here, which of course I indicate starting with the $sign, snake2, snake set 2 in this case, and I can just say, oh, well, that's equal to an object. In this case, that object is an array, and I can just set my values directly like this. So instead of having to go, every individual, as you can see, we're having to repeatedly, over and over again, write the same identifier. Well, we can avoid that and simply use the object initialization method. So just like we did here above, we put the first value, which is our key or our named index, and then the value on the other side of our equal greater than symbol there is going to be the value that's associated with the index or naming there. So of course we just did 1 to 1, we did 2 to 2, 3 to 3, and 4 to 4. And I just threw this in here to kind of give you an example of, you can basically put whatever you want as the value, remember, because this is an array, so the array can store any type of course, value inside of it there for you. There is another way that you can do it. I was having some issues getting the server to support this because of the version that it was using, but there is another initialization method that you can do, and I believe it's a direct bracketed notation where you just directly assign the brackets there. I'm not 100% sure on that syntax. I got to double check that, but I was having some issues getting the server to update versions of PHP. I think we're only using 5.3 or 5.6 on this server right now. I can't remember. But okay, so the next, and then I have spelling errors all over the place here. I'll have to fix those. So the next portion I wanted to kind of step into is going to be the multi-dimensional array that is, of course, in a lot of people's eyes, the kind of scary array. The one that they steer away from, which is the one that's actually the most useful and one of the most handy methods of storing data because of its ability to directly translate, like I mentioned before, into the JSON files. So what I've gone ahead and done here is, you can see I've put a comment here for the multi-dimensional array. So below here, just like we did before, we have our initializer, of course, or excuse me, our identifier, condiments here, and then our $sign to indicate to the machine, of course, we want this to be a variable. And we say, hey, okay, I'm going to create, and for this example, I do it all with the object method. So the object initialization method, that's the way I've done it here, so that we can create this multi-dimensional array. So notice the way I've kind of, do you see how the syntax is lined up like this? And notice, of course, the way that we have our first array here. So this should be, this should, I want to indent that one real quick there. Okay. So notice how we have our first initial array here. So this is the first array, the wrapper array, if you can think of it like that. So this is the parent array. And inside that array, remember, we just have key value pairs. Well, that key value pair can be a key with a value that's another array. So that's what we went ahead and did here. So you can see we have our array here, our first one, which is opening and closing there. But then inside of it, we have our first key value pair, and then of course they're separated all by comments, or excuse me, all separated by commas there. Our first key value pair is bottles for the key, remember our named index in this case. So this array is in position 0. So this is position 0 right here of the indexed array. And then this down here is going to be position 1, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see there what's happening with this array. So what's going on is we have bottles, and then, okay, well, we have different types of bottles of condiments here. Well, then we need another array. So I went ahead and threw an array in there, and course, opens from there, closes there, and we put more key value pairs in here. So we have ketchup bottles. How many of those do we have? Well, we have 100 of them. Mustard bottles, how many of them? Well, we have 50 of them. So, of course, all of them separated by commas. And when you're done, you simply close it, and there you go. You have this nice packaged array with all these boxed up values in there, key value pairs. No problem, that's not too difficult. And that array is a value that has a key called bottles. And we just do the same thing again for packets and for tubs. Of course, having each value stored individually inside. So now you can kind of see how this works. And the neat thing here is, if you wanted to, you could continue to do this. You could throw another one on here and have it tear down even further. It really comes down to the limitation of your application and your ability to keep track of everything. So of course, use good common sense when you're doing this. If it becomes a little bit too complex, you might want to think about maybe breaking it up into two separate associative multi-dimensional array sets or something of that sort. So now you should start to see here, okay, now I have these tools that I can store things in different ways and access them in different ways, but I'm not 100% sure how I access the multi-dimensional array. Well, don't worry, I'll show you that here before we go. It's actually just as easy as accessing a single dimension indexed or associative array. All you do is the identifier, in this case array name, and open and closing bracket there. Oops, move that. Open and closing brackets there. Our first identifier, so remember our first named index, or our first key value, and then our second key value. So remember, what this is going to do is it's going to look for value 1, and it's going to look and it's going to come and be like, oh, okay, so I'm going to look for value 1 and I'm going to look for value 2. Pretty straightforward. So we do an example here. Remember our condiments array. Well, our first value, of course, is tubs. We're looking for the named index tubs. So we come up here. Oh, there's tubs. Oh, look at that. Well, what do we want inside of tubs? Oh, we're looking for ketchup. So there's our name. Oh, well, there's ketchup. And we return the value 10. So let's look at our live example. And hopefully, well, what do you know? There we go. We can find out how many tubs of ketchup we have. So of course, I just kind of explained that out, laid that out for you a little bit easier there so you can see that. Remember, it has the key value pair there, of course. And then when you're pairing them, a key can be assigned to an array as a value. And so that's what we went ahead and did with our multi-dimensional arrays. And these subarrays, of course, can also be associative, which gives you the example, the final example that we have here. So that goes ahead and finishes it up for our discussion on associative arrays and then multi-dimensional arrays, as well as the techniques of accessing them in order to store and get your data. So as always, again, thank you for watching. You can catch me on Twitch, follow me on Twitter, and of course, check out all the rest of my videos. You can continue following the rest of this PHP tutorial. And as always, code for life.